At 2:47 p.m. on July 14, 1944, Chief Mechanic Eddie Foster crouched beneath the roaring engine of a P-51 Mustang, the hum of its power reverberating through his bones. His fingers worked with a precision born of necessity, twisting a bolt here, tightening a screw there. In the midst of the noise and the chaos of the airfield, no one would know that this seemingly simple repair would soon change the course of the war, transforming a good fighter into one of the most feared planes to ever fly at 30,000 feet. But as the plane roared to life once more, Eddie had no idea that his secret modification, an illegal tweak to the engine, was about to make Mustangs untouchable in the skies. Eddie Foster wasn't a pilot. He wasn't even an officer, nor someone who had ever dreamed of fighting in the skies. Born in the quiet heart of Kansas in 1918, he was a simple mechanic by trade, a man who spent his days fixing cars, tractors, and anything else with an engine. When the war broke out, Eddie, like so many others, enlisted in the Army Air Force, though not as a pilot. He had no illusions about being a hero in the air, but there was one thing he knew better than anyone else on base: engines. It wasn't long before Eddie found himself stationed at a British airfield, working on the very P-51 Mustangs that had begun to make their mark over Europe. It was a thankless job, fixing and maintaining the machinery that powered some of the most powerful fighter planes ever built. But Eddie loved it. Each engine was a puzzle, each repair a small victory. He was proud to ensure the pilots could rely on their planes when the stakes were high, but it wasn't until one fateful day, when the P-51s were being pushed to their limits in the relentless dogfights over the skies of France, that Eddie's true genius would come to the forefront. At first, it seemed like just another routine repair. One of the Mustangs had returned to the airfield, its engine sputtering and its fuel consumption higher than normal. The pilot, a young lieutenant named Carter Matthews, had barely made it back after a harrowing engagement with enemy fighters, but when Eddie popped open the cowling, he found the problem wasn't just wear and tear, it was a fundamental flaw in the Mustang's power plant. It was underperforming, and Eddie knew exactly how to fix it. But there was a problem. The fix he had in mind wasn't just a standard repair, it was a modification that could easily be deemed illegal by the higher-ups. It involved pushing the engine beyond its designed limits, giving it more horsepower and speed than the engineers ever intended, the kind of performance tweak that, if discovered, could get Eddie court-martialed. Yet, Eddie didn't hesitate. He knew that this tweak, this risky, illegal modification, could transform the Mustang from a good fighter into a near-unstoppable force. The pilots needed more power to stay competitive in the brutal air battles, and this was the solution. Eddie worked through the night, fabricating the parts he needed and installing them into the engine, the sound of the tools clanging in rhythm with the beat of his heart. The temptation of the unknown was too great. When he finished, Eddie didn't think twice. The next morning, as the sun rose over the airfield, he handed the Mustang back to Lieutenant Matthews, whose eyes widened when he saw the engine's modifications. "You sure this will work, Foster?" Matthews asked, his voice filled with doubt, yet trust in his eyes. "I'm sure, sir," Eddie replied, his voice steady but tinged with the excitement of knowing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Matthews hesitated only for a moment before climbing into the cockpit. The engine roared to life, louder and more powerful than it had ever been. Eddie's heart pounded as the Mustang taxied down the runway. If it worked, if this gamble paid off, it could change everything. As Matthews took off into the sky, Eddie watched, holding his breath. The Mustang streaked through the air like a bird unleashed from its cage, its engine humming with raw power. But even Eddie couldn't have predicted just how much of a game-changer his modification would become. The Mustang was about to become untouchable. The Mustang's engine roared through the air as Lieutenant Carter Matthews pushed the throttle to its limits, feeling the power surge beneath him. It was unlike anything he had experienced before. The aircraft felt lighter, faster, more responsive. He pulled the stick back, climbing higher into the sky, the clouds parting beneath him like a curtain being drawn back on a new world. But as the Mustang sliced through the air, Matthews couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Something was too good to be true. The plane was almost unnervingly stable, and the speed. It was almost as if the laws of physics had been rewritten. The engine purred, smoother than any Mustang he had flown before. Every maneuver was effortless. He was in the sky now, not just as a fighter pilot, but as a predator. Then the radio crackled. "Matthews, this is Squadron Leader Thompson. We've got a band of Messerschmitts closing in on your 6. They're too far to hit you yet, but they're coming in fast." Matthews' stomach tightened. He checked his 6, eyes darting to the horizon. Sure enough, there were 4 enemy aircraft headed straight for him, their silver bodies gleaming in the sunlight. The fight was on, and the stakes were higher than ever, but what happened next felt like something out of a dream. The Mustang responded like it had a mind of its own. Matthews swung the aircraft into a steep dive, a maneuver that would have normally left a lesser plane struggling to keep up. The Mustang cut through the air like a knife, its new engine roaring in approval. Matthews glanced at his gauges. Everything was functioning perfectly. The engine had more thrust than he could have ever imagined. It was, for lack of a better term, a weapon. He leveled out just in time to see the first Messerschmitt barrel toward him. Matthews didn't even think. He pulled the stick back again, executing a tight loop that sent the enemy aircraft skimming right below him. The German pilot didn't know what hit him as Matthews used the Mustang's newfound power to get on his tail, quickly lining up the target. A burst of gunfire, and the enemy plane exploded in a ball of flame. The first kill. Matthews barely had time to process the victory before the other 3 Messerschmitts were on him. His heart pounded as he dove again, avoiding a deadly pass from another German fighter. But something felt wrong. There was an anxiety in the back of his mind, a gnawing doubt. This wasn't just any Mustang, it had something that no one else's plane had. And that made Matthews nervous. He had no idea what kind of power Eddie had installed in this plane, and whether it would hold up against the extreme pressures of combat. "Thompson, I don't know what's going on," Matthews called over the radio. "The Mustang's never been this fast before. I'm not sure if I can control it." "Just focus on the fight, Matthews. Keep it together," came Thompson's voice over the crackling radio. Matthews' grip tightened around the controls. The pressure was mounting. He couldn't let himself think too much about the aircraft's new capabilities. The German pilots were relentless. They dove at him from every angle, trying to shake him off, but the Mustang's power was too much. Matthews knew he had to keep pushing. He had to keep outmaneuvering them, using the speed to his advantage. He could feel the strain in his muscles as he pulled off tight turns and vertical maneuvers. It was almost as though the plane was an extension of his own body, and every decision was instinctive. But just as quickly as the advantage appeared, it began to fade. His fuel gauge was dropping fast. The modifications to the engine had improved the Mustang's speed and agility, but it had come at a cost. The fuel consumption was higher than normal, and Matthews realized that if he didn't finish this fight soon, he'd be grounded with an empty tank. "Thompson, I need a clean shot at the lead plane. Cover me while I get in position." "Roger that, Matthews. You've got a clear path for now." Matthews maneuvered the Mustang, taking a deep breath as he lined up on the leader of the Messerschmitts. His hands were slick on the controls, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was fighting not just the enemy, but the limits of the plane itself. It was as though every twist of the controls pushed him further into uncharted territory. He squeezed the trigger. The plane's guns rattled as a burst of fire sent the German fighter spiraling downward, trailing smoke. Matthews couldn't help but feel a rush of triumph. But before he could process it, the other 2 Messerschmitts closed in, their guns blazing. For a moment, Matthews thought he had miscalculated. The Mustang's power surged again, and Matthews barely kept it from going into a spin. His heart was in his throat. He was on the edge of losing control, not just of the fight, but of the plane itself. He could feel the engine straining under the intense pressure. Then he remembered Eddie's words from the night before when he handed the plane over. "Trust her, Matthews. She'll take you further than you think." With a new surge of adrenaline, Matthews fought back, diving sharply into the fray, using every ounce of skill he had learned in training to dodge and retaliate. The Mustang was still with him, pushing through the impossible. As he tore through the sky, Matthews realized just how much of a risk Eddie had taken. The illegal modifications that had made the Mustang untouchable in the air were also what made it so unpredictable. Eddie had given him a weapon, a dream of speed and power, but it was up to Matthews to learn how to wield it without letting it control him. The moment Matthews locked onto the next Messerschmitt, time seemed to stretch. The sky above him was a blurred canvas of blue, with the streaking trails of enemy planes cutting through it like erratic brushstrokes. But in that moment, everything around him narrowed to a single, laser-focused target. His Mustang had given him a gift: speed, agility, and more firepower than he'd ever imagined. But it came with a price. The unrelenting pressure of the dogfight, the G-forces pulling him in every direction, and the constant fear of running low on fuel gnawed at Matthews' resolve. His mind raced. Could he maintain control? Could he keep his cool long enough to survive? The lead German fighter danced in front of him, trying to shake Matthews off. The pilot's movements were erratic, desperate, but Matthews wasn't fooled. The enemy was smart, and they could see the Mustang's raw power. But Matthews had something they didn't: confidence. The Mustang could take more punishment, move faster, and hit harder. He had to trust that Eddie's modifications would hold up. But the doubts crept in again. As Matthews leveled out and prepared to make his move, a sharp, metallic crack echoed through the cockpit. "What was that?" Matthews muttered under his breath, eyes flicking to the dashboard. A red light blinked on, fuel. The gauge was dangerously low. Matthews' heart sank. The tension in the pit of his stomach tightened, an icy grip of panic creeping up his spine. He was running on fumes, literally. The Mustang's fuel consumption was off the charts. Eddie had warned him the engine would eat up the fuel, but Matthews had never truly understood how critical the situation was until now. "Thompson, this is Matthews. I'm low on fuel, can't keep this up much longer," he shouted into the radio, his voice raw with the strain of the fight. The response was immediate but calm as Squadron Leader Thompson's voice crackled through the airwaves. "Matthews, you've done enough. We've got reinforcements on the way. Get back to base. Don't push it." But Matthews hesitated. He wasn't about to leave. Not after everything he had put into this fight, not after Eddie's risky gamble on the Mustang. He'd come too far. "Negative, Thompson," Matthews replied, his voice steely despite the dread creeping into his chest. "I've got 2 more in my sights. I'm taking them down." The lead Messerschmitt broke hard to the right, attempting to escape. Matthews pushed the Mustang's engine to the limit, his knuckles white on the controls, as he executed a tight, high-speed turn. The Mustang growled beneath him, the engine straining with each desperate move. Matthews' heart raced with the desperate need to outmaneuver the Germans. The world outside blurred into streaks of white and blue as he fought to hold control. His eyes locked onto the enemy plane's tail as he closed in for the kill. His fingers tightened over the trigger. A burst of gunfire echoed through the cockpit, but Matthews' aim was off. He had pushed the Mustang's limits too far, too fast. His fuel gauge flickered again, a sharp reminder that time was running out. But Matthews couldn't stop now. Not when the victory was so close. Not when Eddie had put everything on the line for this very moment. Then, in the midst of his desperation, Matthews had a realization. He wasn't just fighting the Germans. He was fighting the Mustang itself. The more he pushed the engine, the more he realized that the balance between power and control was razor thin. Eddie had given him the tools to win, but the mechanics of the plane, its design, its capabilities, weren't made for this kind of sustained performance. If Matthews didn't get control, if he didn't back off, the Mustang would fail him just as he was about to win. With a growl of frustration, Matthews pulled back, easing off the throttle just enough to regain control. His mind raced as he recalibrated his approach, the stakes higher than ever. The second Messerschmitt had been closing in, its guns aimed straight at Matthews. But now, with a sudden surge of skill and luck, Matthews dove hard again, throwing the Mustang into a sharp roll. The German pilot, overconfident, misjudged the Mustang's speed and followed too closely. Matthews snapped the Mustang around, bringing the guns to bear just as the Messerschmitt flew directly into his sights. He squeezed the trigger and the enemy plane erupted into flames, spiraling down to earth. One more down. "Matthews, get back!" Thompson's voice was urgent now. "That's the last one. Get home now!" Matthews didn't wait for another second. He pushed the Mustang into a dive, heading back toward base as fast as the plane could take him. The sky felt more like a cage than ever, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. With every passing second, he was running on fumes, literally and figuratively. The Mustang had held up, but he knew he couldn't push it much further. His eyes flickered back to the fuel gauge. Empty. Every drop of fuel in the Mustang's tanks had been drained, every ounce of energy in the engine burned. Matthews' pulse raced as he fought to bring the plane back to the safety of the airfield. But as he descended, the thought that had been gnawing at him became clearer. The Mustang was a weapon, yes, but it wasn't invincible. Eddie's illegal modification had made it untouchable in combat, but it was also pushing it beyond what it had been designed to do. Matthews managed to glide the Mustang back to the airfield, landing just as the engine sputtered and died. The crew that rushed to the plane greeted him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Lieutenant Matthews, what in the hell did you do to that plane?" one of the ground crewmen asked, his eyes wide with astonishment. Matthews grinned, sweat dripping down his face, his hands shaking from the adrenaline. "You can thank Eddie Foster for that. He turned this Mustang into a monster." As Matthews climbed out of the cockpit, he saw Eddie standing a short distance away, watching with quiet pride. Eddie's face was unreadable, but Matthews knew what was coming next. "You did good, Matthews," Eddie said simply. "I just gave her a little more power than anyone thought possible." Matthews nodded. "You gave her everything." But deep down, Matthews knew that Eddie's illegal mod had changed more than just the Mustang. It had changed the way they thought about the war, about winning. It had opened a door to new possibilities, a door that they had no idea they were about to walk through. The Mustang wasn't just a plane anymore. It was a weapon of war, a symbol of what could be achieved when ingenuity, guts, and a willingness to break the rules came together. The hours following the successful mission were a blur. Lieutenant Matthews had landed safely, the adrenaline of the fight slowly ebbing as the reality of the situation sank in. The Mustang had survived, but Matthews had been lucky. Eddie's modification had been a gamble, one that had paid off, but only just. Matthews couldn't help but feel the weight of what they had done. As he made his way toward the briefing room, his mind kept replaying the combat. The speed, the control, the incredible power of the Mustang. But there was something nagging at him, a feeling deep in his gut that the victory was too close, too fragile. Eddie had given them a gift, but Matthews wondered just how much further they could push this aircraft before it came crashing down. "Matthews," came the voice of Squadron Leader Thompson, snapping him out of his thoughts. The squadron leader stood just inside the briefing room, his expression tense, eyes sharp. "I need to see you." Matthews stepped forward, trying to steady his breath. There was no mistaking the urgency in Thompson's voice. The fight wasn't over. They had only just scratched the surface of what Eddie's modifications could do, but there was still so much unknown. "Sir?" Matthews asked as he entered the room. "Take a seat," Thompson motioned, and Matthews did, his heart pounding slightly faster. "I've been reviewing your report, and there's something I need to make clear. You're going to get a lot of attention for what happened today. Good attention. But there's also a lot of risk." Matthews frowned, trying to keep his composure. He didn't know what Thompson meant. He had done his job, and he had done it well. But the more Thompson spoke, the more Matthews realized that there were consequences. "We've received word from command," Thompson continued, his tone serious. "You're not supposed to be using those modifications on your Mustang. It's not approved. Eddie's work, well, let's just say it's unauthorized. If anyone finds out, both of you could be in hot water." Matthews swallowed hard, the room suddenly feeling much smaller. "What are you saying, sir? Eddie's modifications saved my life today. They gave us the edge. There's no way we would have taken out those German planes without it." "I know that," Thompson replied quickly, his voice softening, "but I also know that the higher-ups don't care about that. They care about the rules, and we're pushing the limits here. You've got to think about the long-term consequences. If command finds out, Eddie will be branded a traitor, and you'll both be court-martialed." Matthews' heart sank. The realization hit him hard, like a punch to the gut. He had known there would be risks, but he had never imagined this, being caught in the crossfire of bureaucracy and military politics. "Do you think Eddie should stop?" Matthews asked, his voice low. Thompson sighed deeply, looking Matthews in the eyes. "I'm not saying that. Eddie's a genius, and what he's done has given us an incredible advantage. But there's a fine line between innovation and insubordination. If you push too hard, it'll break, and you'll be the ones caught in the fallout." Matthews sat back, a mix of confusion and frustration swirling inside him. He had trusted Eddie. He had trusted the plane, and they had won. They had succeeded against impossible odds. But now, the very thing that had given them the victory was the thing that could tear them apart. "You've got a choice to make, Matthews," Thompson said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You can either continue using the Mustang with Eddie's modifications and risk everything, or you can report it and shut this down before it gets out of control." Matthews looked down at the floor, processing the weight of Thompson's words. For a long moment, he said nothing. The tension in the room was suffocating, and Matthews felt torn between two worlds. Eddie's ingenuity had given them a real chance to make a difference in the war, but the rules were clear, and if they broke them, it could cost them everything. "Sir," Matthews finally spoke, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty, "I can't just stop. Eddie's created something that works, something that's given us an edge in this fight. If we turn back now, if we don't push forward, all of this will be for nothing." Thompson nodded slowly, as if he had expected Matthews to say that. "I understand, Matthews. But just remember, the higher-ups will make their own decisions no matter what we do. If you're going to fight this, you need to be prepared for the fallout." The words hung heavy in the air as Matthews stood up. His mind raced, unsure of what path to take. But he knew one thing. He couldn't turn back now. Not after everything they had done. Not after Eddie's sacrifice. "Understood, sir," Matthews said quietly, his voice tight with resolve. "We'll keep pushing. We'll prove it's worth it." As Matthews left the room, he felt a renewed sense of determination wash over him. The war wasn't just about battles in the sky. It was about the choices they made, the risks they took, and whether or not they were willing to fight for something greater than themselves. Eddie's modifications had changed the game, but now Matthews had to decide. Would he fight for it, no matter the cost? The days that followed Matthews' conversation with Squadron Leader Thompson were a whirlwind of mixed emotions. Matthews had always prided himself on following the rules, on playing by the book. But this was different. The Mustang, Eddie's Mustang, wasn't just a plane. It was a symbol of innovation, a product of raw, untapped potential. And Matthews was determined to prove that it wasn't just the modifications that had made it superior, It was what they could do with it. He knew what was at stake. If anyone found out about Eddie's illegal modifications, everything they had worked for would come crumbling down. But Matthews wasn't ready to back down. The plane had given them an edge in the fight against the Germans, and he wasn't about to let that advantage slip away. The tension in the air was palpable. Matthews could feel it as he approached the airfield every morning, like a storm waiting to break. Eddie, ever the quiet genius, continued to work on the planes with the same meticulous care he had always shown. But even he couldn't ignore the whispers starting to circulate. There were murmurs about the Mustang's new performance, and the higher-ups were beginning to take notice. "Matthews!" Eddie called out one morning as Matthews approached the hangar. "Got a minute?" Matthews walked over, trying to keep his composure. He had been avoiding Eddie's eyes for the past few days, unsure how to talk about the mounting pressure and the looming danger of getting caught. But now, standing in front of Eddie, he knew they couldn't keep ignoring the truth. "Yeah. What's up, Eddie?" Matthews asked, his voice casual but his mind racing. Eddie motioned to the Mustang he had been working on. "I've been tweaking something, just a small adjustment. You know, getting the engine tuned just right for the next mission." Matthews felt a wave of unease wash over him. Eddie had been tinkering more than usual lately. Every modification was a step further toward making the plane something that could break all the rules. Eddie was pushing boundaries, and Matthews wasn't sure if he could keep up anymore. "I need you to be careful, Eddie," Matthews said, his voice low, careful. What you're doing. If someone finds out—" Eddie turned and looked him in the eyes, his face calm but resolute. "I know what I'm doing, Matthews. I don't take risks without understanding the consequences. But look, you've seen it, haven't you? The Mustang's flying better than anything we've got. We're out there fighting for our lives, and this is the best shot we've got." Matthews nodded, feeling the weight of Eddie's words sink in. Eddie wasn't wrong. They had seen the difference in the skies. The Mustang had given them the upper hand, and the power of those modifications had been undeniable. But Matthews couldn't ignore the dangers of taking this fight to the next level. "I know," Matthews said quietly. "But if this gets out, if the higher-ups get wind of this—" Eddie held up a hand, cutting him off. "If it gets out, it's on me. I can't just sit here, playing it safe while we're losing men out there. I've built something that works, and I'm not going to stop now." The intensity in Eddie's voice was unmistakable, a raw passion for the work he had done. Matthews could see the fire in Eddie's eyes, and for a moment he understood. This wasn't just about winning battles. This was about pushing forward, about doing what no one had thought possible, and showing the world that they could take on the impossible. Matthews sighed deeply. He knew Eddie was right. The risks were immense, but so were the rewards. They had the chance to change the course of this war, if they could pull it off. "I just don't want to see you get hurt," Matthews said softly, his eyes searching Eddie's face. "Or any of us, for that matter." Eddie smiled slightly, the kind of smile that only came when he knew something Matthews didn't. "You've been flying her, right? You felt the difference. We're just getting started." Matthews nodded. He had felt it. The power. The speed. The Mustang was a force to be reckoned with, and no one had ever imagined it could be like this. But with that power came a responsibility. The kind of responsibility that could break them just as easily as it could lift them higher. "I'll keep flying her, Eddie," Matthews said, his voice quiet, but full of determination. "I'll keep pushing, but we need to be careful. We need to stay ahead of the game. If we get caught, everything we've done will be for nothing." Eddie clapped him on the shoulder, his eyes twinkling with an unspoken understanding. "Don't worry, Matthews, we're not getting caught. Not yet." But deep down, Matthews knew they were walking a thin line. Eddie's modifications had changed everything. But it was clear now. The more they pushed the Mustang, the more they would have to answer for. They couldn't keep this secret forever, and the higher-ups wouldn't be forgiving once they caught wind of what Eddie had done. For now, though, Matthews had to trust Eddie, and trust in the Mustang's power. They were in this together, but the truth was, Matthews wasn't sure how long they could keep flying this high before the crash came. The day the breakthrough came, Matthews woke up to a tension that hung over the airfield like a storm cloud. The skies were clear, the sun just beginning to rise, casting long shadows over the rows of Mustangs lined up on the tarmac. But inside Matthews, a deep unease settled in his gut. It wasn't just the knowledge that the modifications Eddie had made were far from standard. It was the sense that something was about to change, and he couldn't control it. He walked toward the hangar, where Eddie was already working, his hands a blur as he made last-minute tweaks to the Mustang's engine. Matthews hadn't said much since their conversation, but deep down, he knew Eddie had crossed a line. They were about to push the Mustang harder than they ever had before. "You ready for this?" Matthews asked, his voice low as he approached Eddie, who was wiping his hands on a rag, his face streaked with grease. Eddie didn't look up immediately. He was focused, more determined than ever. "Always ready," he muttered, his voice as steady as ever, even though Matthews could see the flicker of excitement in his eyes. Matthews paused, then nodded. "Let's get to it." The mission ahead was going to be a critical one, another raid on enemy territory, another opportunity to test the Mustang's limits. This time, the stakes were higher. The enemy knew they were coming. The odds were stacked against them, and Matthews wasn't sure if their modifications would hold up under the pressure. But as he climbed into the cockpit that day, he realized one thing. They were in this together, and there was no turning back. The engines roared to life, the unmistakable hum of the Mustang vibrating through the fuselage as Matthews taxied down the runway. The crew around him seemed to be holding their breath, watching him carefully, waiting for the moment when the Mustang would prove its worth. Matthews felt it too, the weight of expectation. But more than that, it was the quiet fear that the engine, despite Eddie's brilliance, might fail under the stress of combat. As the Mustang lifted off, Matthews felt the rush of air beneath him. The plane was lighter than ever, almost effortless in its climb. He glanced at the gauges, watching the numbers tick steadily higher. The Mustang was a machine now, more than a plane. It was an extension of everything they had fought for, everything they had hoped would give them an edge in the sky. And for the first time, Matthews felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. The flight was smooth, almost too smooth, as the Mustang sped through the clouds. But Matthews couldn't shake the nagging sense of something waiting to go wrong. They were heading into enemy territory, and the risk was immense. It wasn't just about outmaneuvering the Germans. It was about surviving long enough to turn the tide of the battle. He couldn't let the modifications be the thing that ended it all. Then, suddenly, the radio crackled with a familiar voice. "Matthews, this is Squadron Leader Thompson. We've got a squadron of BF-109s coming in hot. You need to get to their 6 and hit them fast. We're relying on you." Matthews' heart raced as his eyes darted to the horizon. He could see them now. 4 enemy planes, their sleek forms cutting through the sky, closing the distance fast. He flipped the switch, engaging the Mustang's guns with a quick press of the button. As he pulled the throttle forward, the engine roared louder and Matthews could feel the power surge beneath him. He pulled the Mustang into a steep climb, heading directly toward the approaching Germans. The speed and agility of the Mustang were unlike anything Matthews had ever experienced. With each movement, the Mustang responded seamlessly, as if the plane was anticipating his every thought. He couldn't deny it anymore. Eddie's modifications had made the Mustang a beast in the air. But as the BF-109s closed in, Matthews had to focus. There was no time for second-guessing. The fight was on. The first BF-109 came at him, guns blazing. Matthews swerved, his hands working in perfect synchronization with the plane as it twisted in the air, narrowly dodging the enemy fire. The Mustang responded immediately, the engine roaring with power, giving Matthews the speed to counter every move. He locked onto the enemy fighter's tail, his finger on the trigger, but hesitated for just a moment. The moment was enough. The enemy pilot broke off, recognizing the Mustang's superior maneuverability. Matthews didn't wait for the next opportunity. He closed the gap, firing a quick burst at the enemy plane. The shots hit their mark, and the Bf-109 exploded into a fireball, spiraling toward the ground. "That's one down," Matthews muttered, his breath coming in short bursts. But there was no time to celebrate. He immediately turned his attention to the remaining 3 German fighters. They were coming at him again, undeterred by the loss of their comrade. The next few moments were a blur of speed, precision, and adrenaline. The Mustang cut through the air like it was designed to do nothing else but destroy. Matthews dodged incoming fire, his body pressed against the seat as the plane climbed and dove in a series of tight maneuvers. The engine held steady, its raw power keeping him one step ahead of the enemy. With a sudden surge, Matthews pulled the Mustang into a steep dive, the speed building with each second. He leveled out just behind one of the Bf-109s, and with a burst of gunfire, the enemy plane exploded in a shower of metal and flames. 2 down. Matthews' pulse quickened, but there was still more to do. He needed to get the final 2. His Mustang had proved its worth in this battle, but it wasn't enough to stop the war. Not yet. The remaining German fighters were now scattering, trying to regroup, but Matthews was relentless. He knew he had the edge. The Mustang's engine had given him the performance he needed, and he wasn't about to let it go to waste. As he closed in on the last enemy plane, Matthews' mind cleared. There was no more doubt, no more hesitation, just the thrill of the chase, the fire in his gut, and the roar of the Mustang's engine as he locked onto his final target. With a steady hand, Matthews squeezed the trigger. The enemy plane exploded in front of him, the flames licking the sky as the wreckage tumbled to the earth below. The Mustang had done it. Eddie's modifications had turned the tide of the battle. They had succeeded where others had failed. As Matthews turned the Mustang back toward base, his heart still racing, he knew this wasn't just a victory. It was a statement. The Mustang was more than just a fighter plane now, it was a game changer. But Matthews also knew that this was only the beginning. What they had accomplished was extraordinary, but there was still a long way to go. The war was far from over, and Eddie's modifications would have to face greater tests before they could truly prove their worth. As Matthews's Mustang touched down on the airfield, the roar of the engine gradually faded, replaced by the thrum of his own heartbeat. His hands still gripped the controls, the familiar pressure now joined by an overwhelming sense of triumph. They had done it. Against all odds, against the skepticism that had followed Eddie's modifications, they had proven that the Mustang wasn't just a good fighter, it was the best. The ground crew rushed over as Matthews taxied the Mustang back to its designated spot. They were all eager to congratulate him, eyes wide with admiration, but Matthews didn't feel like celebrating. Not yet. There was still a part of him that remained unsure of the consequences, unsure of how long this new advantage could last. As he climbed out of the cockpit, Matthews saw Eddie standing near the hangar, watching with a quiet but knowing look. There were no cheers from the mechanic, no words of praise. Just a small, satisfied smile. It was as if Eddie had always known that this moment would come. Matthews couldn't help but feel a wave of respect for the man who had taken the risks and built something that had just changed the entire course of the war. "Nice flying, Lieutenant," Eddie said, his voice steady but with an edge of pride. Matthews nodded. "Couldn't have done it without you, Eddie. This plane, it's a game changer. But it's more than that. It's a statement." Eddie just shrugged, as though the weight of their success wasn't what mattered to him. "It's just the beginning, Matthews. What we've got here is special. But we can't stop now. We've got more to prove." Matthews watched as Eddie turned back to the Mustang, inspecting it with a mechanic's eye, always thinking ahead. There was something about Eddie's calm that steadied him, even when Matthews knew the stakes were rising. They had made their mark, but the higher-ups were bound to take notice. They couldn't afford to rest on this victory. In the briefing room later that day, Squadron Leader Thompson gave Matthews a pointed look as he walked in. The room was filled with tension, and Matthews could tell the higher-ups were already aware of what had happened. Thompson cleared his throat before speaking. "Well, Matthews," Thompson began, his voice grave, "it seems you've made quite an impression. The higher command has heard about your little tweak to the Mustang's engine, and they're not thrilled about it." Matthews' stomach twisted. He knew this moment was coming. The risk had always been there, the knowledge that they were operating outside the boundaries of the regulations. But now, the stakes were about to get even higher. Thompson continued, "They're impressed with the results, no doubt. Your mission was a success, and you've got the kills to show for it. But they're not just interested in results, they're interested in keeping things by the book. They want answers." Matthews took a deep breath, his mind working fast. "And what do you want me to say, sir?" Matthews asked, his voice steady. "I did my job. I got the job done. Eddie did his part. I don't think anyone in this room is going to argue with the results." Thompson's gaze hardened, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "You're right. But the rules matter too. You know as well as I do that if word gets out about those modifications, Eddie and you are going to be in serious trouble." The room was quiet for a moment as Matthews absorbed the weight of Thompson's words. He could feel the tension in the air, the pressure mounting from every direction. They had done something extraordinary, but the question was, would it be enough to protect them? Matthews stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not going to lie about it, sir. But I also know we've got something here that can change the war. If we don't use it, if we don't push forward, we're wasting the opportunity we've been given." Thompson looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I can't promise you anything, Matthews, but I can't deny what you've done. It's up to command now. We'll see where this goes." The conversation ended there, but Matthews knew the fight was far from over. They had taken the first step in changing the course of the war, but now they had to prove it, not just to themselves, but to the military and to the world. Eddie's modification wasn't just a technical breakthrough, it was a symbol of the risk they were willing to take to win. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and silent evaluations. The higher-ups continued to deliberate on what to do with the Mustang's newfound power. Some of them were hesitant. Others were eager to capitalize on it. But in the end, it was Matthews' performance and Eddie's ingenuity that carried the day. Within a few weeks, orders came down from command. The Mustang's modifications were to be tested across the board. Eddie's illegal tweak had become the foundation for a new strategy, one that would soon be rolled out across the entire squadron. But the victory was bittersweet. Matthews and Eddie were now part of something larger than they had ever imagined, but they couldn't ignore the shadow of what might come. They had won this battle, but the war, the real fight, was still ahead. The airfield buzzed with an uneasy energy as the new orders came down. Matthews had never seen so many eyes on him. Pilots, ground crews, officers. Everyone was waiting for the next step. The Mustang's modification, once considered a risky, borderline illegal adjustment, was now the focus of every strategist in the squadron. Eddie's work had become their lifeline in the sky, and the pressure was mounting to prove that this wasn't just a fluke. That this wasn't just the luck of one successful mission, but the beginning of a game-changing strategy. Matthews had been to war before. He had faced fear, loss, and the brutal reality of combat. But now, as he prepared for another mission, the weight of this new responsibility threatened to crush him. He was no longer just a pilot. He was the face of this new weapon, the symbol of the Mustang's untouchable power. The success of this next mission would prove whether Eddie's modifications were truly the turning point they needed, or whether it was all just a temporary advantage. And Matthews wasn't sure which outcome he feared more. He walked toward his Mustang with a grim determination, his boots crunching on the gravel, each step heavier than the last. The sky above was clear, but there was no sense of calm in Matthews. As he approached the aircraft, he saw the ground crew working on the engine, adjusting, tweaking. The modifications had already become routine. But the truth was, the Mustang wasn't a routine machine anymore. It was a prototype, a one-of-a-kind weapon, and Matthews was about to fly it into battle again. And with it, he was about to face every doubt that had been building in his mind. "You nervous?" The voice came from behind him, and Matthews turned to see Eddie walking toward him, wiping his hands on his overalls. "Of course I am," Matthews said with a bitter smile. "I'm about to fly the Mustang that could either change the course of the war or end my career." Eddie chuckled, but there was no real humor in it. "I'm not worried about you. I'm worried about what happens if they find out how we did it." Matthews nodded, his jaw tightening. He knew Eddie wasn't just talking about their secret. He was talking about the larger picture, the risk they had both taken by pushing the Mustang beyond its limits. If the higher-ups found out, it would all come crashing down. And that fear, that looming possibility, hung over them like a cloud, impossible to escape. "You ever wonder if we've gone too far?" Matthews asked, his voice quieter now. Eddie paused, his expression unreadable. "I've spent my whole life building things, Matthews, things that worked, things that weren't supposed to work. But this Mustang, it's different, and maybe that's exactly what we need right now." Matthews stared at the Mustang, its sleek wings shining under the morning sun, its engine humming as the ground crew finished their work. Eddie's words had an edge of truth to them, but Matthews couldn't shake the uncertainty. He had flown this aircraft, felt its power, its speed, and he knew it was more than just a plane. But was that enough? Would it be enough to win the war? As Matthews climbed into the cockpit, the familiar hum of the engine vibrated through his body. His hands gripped the controls, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of Eddie's quiet resolve, of the other pilots who would be watching him, waiting to see if the Mustang's modifications were the answer they had all been looking for. There were so many unknowns still, so many risks. The radio crackled, pulling him back to the present. "Matthews, this is Squadron Leader Thompson. You're clear for takeoff. We need you to engage the enemy fighters. Standard procedure, you know the drill." Matthews nodded, his voice steady, though he could feel his pulse quicken. "Roger that, Squadron Leader, ready for action." As the Mustang roared to life, Matthews felt a surge of adrenaline, the rush of taking flight once again. But this time, it wasn't just about the fight. It was about proving something. To the higher-ups, to the rest of the squadron, to himself. He was flying not just for survival, but for validation. The Mustang tore across the sky as Matthews climbed higher, the vast expanse of the world below him shrinking with every second. He could see the enemy fighters now, their sharp forms cutting through the clouds, closing in on his squadron. Matthews' heart pounded, his senses sharpening. This was it. The moment of truth, as he locked onto the first enemy plane, his hands steady on the controls. Matthews felt something shift. The Mustang's engine purred beneath him, its power overwhelming in the best way possible. This wasn't just about speed, it was about control. The Mustang responded with a grace Matthews hadn't expected, its maneuverability unmatched. He felt like he was one with the aircraft, the sharp, responsive machine at his fingertips. But, as the first enemy plane came into range, Matthews hesitated for just a moment. It was the smallest flicker of doubt, a fleeting thought. Was this the right decision? Had Eddie's modifications really made the Mustang untouchable, or had they just been lucky? The question lingered in his mind for a split second too long, and that was when the enemy fired. The plane rattled with the first burst of gunfire. Matthews immediately swerved, narrowly dodging the incoming shots, his instincts kicking in. The Mustang responded immediately, its engine roaring as Matthews dove and banked, pulling away from the enemy's line of fire. The battle was on. Matthews knew this was no longer just about the Mustang. It was about the trust they had put in each other. Eddie had given him the tools. Now, Matthews had to prove they worked, prove that this wasn't just a fluke. As he pulled the Mustang into a steep climb, Matthews locked onto the first enemy fighter and fired. The explosion was immediate, a bright burst of fire against the clear blue sky. One down. But as he dove after the second fighter, Matthews' doubt returned. This wasn't just about flying better or faster. It was about survival. It was about their ability to adapt, to prove that Eddie's modifications weren't just a momentary advantage. They were the future of the war. And Matthews had to prove it. The Mustang's engine roared beneath Matthews as he dived again, narrowly avoiding another burst of enemy gunfire. The sky was alive with movement, the chaos of war unfolding around him. His mind, though, remained focused. He had already taken down one enemy fighter, but the battle was far from over. The remaining German planes were circling, waiting for their chance to strike, and Matthews knew he couldn't afford to make another mistake. As he leveled out, his eyes darted to the remaining enemy fighters, their sleek bodies cutting through the clouds with surgical precision. Matthews could feel the weight of their presence. They were closing in, and their superior numbers meant that the slightest mistake could cost him everything. But he couldn't back down. He couldn't hesitate. Not after everything Eddie had risked to give them this chance. Eddie had given him a Mustang that wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of possibility. The modifications Eddie had made had proven themselves in that first mission. Now it was up to Matthews to prove that this was no fluke, that the Mustang could take on the world. He pushed the throttle forward, the Mustang's engine roaring in response, and dove toward the nearest enemy plane. This time, he wasn't holding back. Matthews had learned from his previous hesitation. There was no room for doubt now. The Mustang was a weapon, and he was the one wielding it. The first enemy fighter appeared in his sights, and Matthews squeezed the trigger without thinking. The burst of fire tore through the German plane's wing, sending it spiraling down in a trail of smoke and debris. Matthews' heart raced, but he didn't let up. There were still 2 more to go, and every second mattered. Matthews, this is Thompson. You're doing great, but don't get cocky. We need you to clear the skies or we're going to be sitting ducks. The voice in his earpiece was a reminder that the stakes were higher than just personal victory. The squadron was depending on him. The higher-ups were watching, and the enemy was still very much a threat. Matthews tightened his grip on the controls, forcing the Mustang to perform another tight loop. As the plane surged forward, he felt the engine respond like it was made for this very moment. The power that Eddie had given him wasn't just about speed, it was about control, precision, and adaptability, and Matthews was learning how to use it to its full potential. Another burst of gunfire cracked through the sky, this time hitting one of the remaining German planes. Matthews's heart skipped a beat as the enemy aircraft spiraled downward, its wing torn apart by the Mustang's assault. But there was still one left, one more plane that would stop at nothing to take him down. The remaining Messerschmitt banked hard, trying to throw Matthews off, but Matthews was already on its tail, maneuvering the Mustang with ease. The enemy pilot tried to outfly him, but Matthews wasn't about to let that happen. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when the Mustang's modifications would either prove their worth or fail entirely. The 2 planes swirled around each other in a high-speed chase, Matthews pushing the Mustang to its limits. The engine screamed as it tore through the air, the airspeed climbing higher and higher. Matthews felt the weight of the G-forces pressing against him, but he refused to let go. This was it. He had to take the shot. With one final desperate maneuver, Matthews pulled the Mustang into a hard climb, watching as the enemy fighter continued to fly straight into his line of sight. He squeezed the trigger just as the German plane passed in front of him. The burst of fire connected, and the enemy plane erupted into a ball of fire, falling from the sky in a trail of smoke. Matthews exhaled, the tension in his chest easing. The last enemy plane was gone. He had done it. The Mustang had done it. They had proven, beyond any doubt, that Eddie's modifications were the key to winning the air war. As Matthews pulled the Mustang into a wide loop to return to base, his mind raced. They had just accomplished the impossible, again. But even as he felt the thrill of victory, another thought crept into his mind. What now? How long would the higher-ups allow them to keep flying this modified Mustang? How long would it be before the risks caught up to them? Matthews pushed the thought aside. For now, they had won. For now, they had succeeded. But he knew the war was far from over. And with every victory, the consequences of their choices would only grow greater. As he landed the Mustang and taxied back to the hangar, Matthews could already see the ground crew gathering around, eager to congratulate him. He could hear their cheers, but they felt distant, muted by the weight of what he knew was coming. The higher-ups would want answers. Eddie's modifications would be under scrutiny, and Matthews wasn't sure how long they could keep flying this high before it all came crashing down. But that was a question for another day. For now, Matthews allowed himself to enjoy the victory, because it wasn't just his, it was Eddie's. It was their shared victory. And no matter what happened next, Matthews knew one thing for sure. They had changed the course of the war. The Mustang had become untouchable, and it had all started with one man's gamble. The days following Matthews' victory in the sky were filled with a mixture of pride, uncertainty, and the pressure of knowing that what had been accomplished couldn't be undone. The Mustang, now a symbol of innovation, had outperformed every expectation. Eddie's modifications had given them the edge in the air, but Matthews couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the consequences of this success were just beginning to unfold. The higher-ups were watching. Command had noticed the Mustang's superior performance, and with that came attention, scrutiny. What had started as a quiet modification had now become a game-changer in the war effort. And the higher the stakes got, the more Matthews and Eddie found themselves on the edge of a precipice. Matthews sat in the briefing room, his uniform pressed and spotless, his hands resting on the table. Around him, the squadron leaders and higher-ranking officers murmured among themselves, eyes flicking to him every so often. Matthews could feel the weight of their gaze. They were waiting for him to speak, for him to confirm what they already knew. That the Mustang was a force to be reckoned with, and they had no idea how to handle it. Squadron Leader Thompson stood at the front, his voice low but commanding. "Lieutenant Matthews, I won't beat around the bush. Your performance has exceeded all expectations. The Mustang's modifications have given us a distinct advantage in the air, and I'm not just talking about the statistics. You've proven that we can outperform the enemy, outmaneuver them, but that doesn't mean we can ignore the risks involved." Matthews swallowed hard. He had heard this before. The higher-ups wanted results, but they also wanted control. They wanted the Mustang to be theirs, something they could replicate and standardize. What they didn't understand was that Eddie's modifications weren't something that could be mass-produced. They were the result of a single, brilliant mind pushing the boundaries of what was possible. And Matthews knew the higher-ups wouldn't be satisfied with just one success. They would want more. They would demand more. "Sir," Matthews said, his voice steady, though his insides churned, "the Mustang's modifications have given us the edge we need, but they won't last unless we continue to innovate, continue to push the limits. Eddie's work, what we've done, it's just the beginning. We can't stop now." Thompson studied Matthews for a long moment before nodding. "I agree. The problem is the higher-ups don't. They're concerned about sustainability, about risk management. They want more data, more proof. They want to make sure this can be replicated and scaled, and that's something we're not sure we can do yet. Matthews felt his chest tighten. Eddie's modifications had worked. They had proven that the Mustang was a superior aircraft, far beyond what anyone had imagined. But now, that very success was putting them in a dangerous position. They were pushing the boundaries of what was allowed, and the consequences were inevitable. They don't understand, do they? Matthews asked quietly. They don't understand what we've done. They think it's a fluke. Thompson's gaze hardened. They want results, Matthews, not theories, not risks. They'll keep pushing you, keep pushing us, until they get what they want. Matthews felt a knot form in his stomach. The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Now, the war wasn't just in the skies. It was on the ground, with the bureaucrats and the higher-ups who held the power to either support or destroy everything Eddie had worked for. The meeting ended without resolution. Matthews left the briefing room with a heavy heart, knowing that the Mustang had changed the game, but also that they had now stepped into a much larger battle, one of politics, power, and control. As Matthews walked through the hangar toward Eddie, he could feel the weight of their future hanging over them. They had succeeded, but the price of that success was starting to show. The Mustang had become more than just a plane. It had become a symbol of rebellion, of innovation, of defiance, and that was a double-edged sword. Eddie was at the far end of the hangar, bent over a workbench, his hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who knew every inch of the machine they were building. Matthews walked up to him, his thoughts still churning. "We've made it this far," Matthews said quietly, breaking the silence. "But I don't know if we can keep going like this. The higher-ups are starting to push back. They want results, but they don't understand what we're doing here. They want to mass-produce, something that's not meant to be replicated." Eddie looked up, his expression calm, unbothered. "We've been pushing the limits, Matthews. We always have. They don't like it, but that's not going to stop us. It's not about following the rules. It's about winning the war, and right now, this," he gestured toward the Mustang, "this is the way we win." Matthews took a deep breath. He knew Eddie was right. They had taken risks. They had done something that no one else had thought possible. But now, those risks were about to catch up with them, and Matthews wasn't sure how long they could keep running from the consequences. For now, though, all he could do was trust Eddie, trust the Mustang, and keep flying. As the war pressed on, Matthews and Eddie remained at the forefront of the Mustang's story. The higher-ups had continued to demand more data, more results, and more assurances. But, despite their reservations and the mounting pressure, Matthews couldn't deny the Mustang's impact. The modified aircraft had done exactly what they had hoped. It had transformed the way they fought, giving them the upper hand in the skies. But with every victory, the stakes only grew higher. The tension between military command and Matthews' squadron became palpable, and the promise of new innovations felt like a double-edged sword. They were caught between the exhilarating rush of their success and the impending consequences of going against the rules. Yet Matthews knew deep down, as did Eddie, that the results spoke for themselves. The war was not won with tactics alone. It was won by individuals willing to push boundaries, to risk everything for the possibility of something greater. Eddie had done just that. He had given them a machine that no one could have imagined, a machine that made the impossible possible. But it wasn't just the Mustang itself that mattered. It was the spirit of defiance that came with it. It was the willingness to step into unknown territory, to break the rules when the stakes were high, and to put everything on the line for victory. Matthews had become more than just a pilot. He was a symbol of what they had fought for. The belief that the war could be won not just with brute force, but with ingenuity, with innovation, and with the courage to defy conventional thinking. As the war finally drew to a close, Matthews stood in the hangar once more, looking at the Mustang in front of him. The war had ended, but the legacy of what they had accomplished wasn't. The modifications that Eddie had made had sparked a revolution in aerial warfare. What had started as a risky, unapproved change had become a foundation for the future of fighter planes. The Mustang, once just another warbird, had become a symbol of hope, of what could be achieved when the impossible was embraced. The final days of the war brought mixed emotions. Relief, certainly, but also the understanding that this success would be remembered, but perhaps not in the way Matthews or Eddie had imagined. They had fought, innovated, and survived. But now, as peace settled in, Matthews wondered how history would remember them. Would they be recognized for their audacity, for their willingness to break the mold? Or would they simply fade into the pages of history as just another footnote in the grand scope of the war? Eddie's work was remembered by the men who had flown the Mustang. They understood the importance of what he had done, even if it had come at a cost. And though the official records might never give Eddie the full credit he deserved, Matthews knew the truth. Eddie had changed the game. As Matthews and Eddie prepared to return home, they knew that the Mustang's legacy was not just in its performance. It was in the daring spirit that had driven them to make it better, to push the boundaries of what was thought possible, and to achieve victory where it seemed impossible. Years passed, and the world moved on from the war. But Matthews never forgot the Mustang. He never forgot the risks they took, the moments of doubt, and the triumphs that came from pushing the limits. It wasn't just about the aircraft. It was about what it represented, the human spirit's ability to defy the odds and break through when everything seemed stacked against it. Eddie Foster, the mechanic who had started it all, remained a quiet figure in the background. His name wasn't written in the history books the way some might have expected, but Matthews would always remember him. Eddie had been the catalyst, the spark that had turned the Mustang into an unstoppable force. As Matthews sat alone in a small room, the evening light streaming through the window, he realized that what they had done would live on. Not in the form of medals or awards, but in the memories of the men who had flown, fought, and survived. The legacy of the Mustang was far greater than any aircraft. It was the legacy of defiance, of ingenuity, of believing that no matter how impossible the odds, there was always a way forward. And in that way, Matthews knew their success wasn't just measured by victories in the sky. It was measured by the impact they had left on the world, an impact that would never fade.